The overriding thing is look at the trajectory of Britain in the last 30 years and it's an absolute catastrophe. Britain's lost £1 trillion of value out of its stock market in the last 30 years.
Andrew Craig is the author of How to Own the World and founder of Plain English Finance. His new book is Our Future is Biotech. Is this the answer to the UK's growth problem?
The last century has been about tech and physics. The next century is going to be about biology and biotech.
The reason we've got you on today is because what I love about your work, every time I ever hear you speak, and both your books, the new one, Our Future is Biotech and How to Own the World, is your optimism for the world.
Yeah.
I think it's really refreshing. I think in a world of doom porn, you kind of stand out.
Hopefully quite evidence-based as well, which is why it's not just naivety. But,
yeah. You open the book with a quote. You say, on what principle is it that on nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but sorry. Yeah. Do you know the quote?
On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration ahead of us?
Yeah, that's good. That's it. Perfect. Thank you. What I want to do, on that optimistic note, I want to start by just talking how bad the UK is at the minute.
Yeah, well, so I was going to say, so you got me here on the false pretenses. Let's talk about how terrible Britain is, and how
to fix it.
Yeah, well, actually, and that's really elegant, isn't it? Okay, so what's the problem? We all know about cost of living crisis. We all know, put things in Britain feel pretty poor at the moment. I'm a big, along with what you guys do, I'm a big fan of Chris Williamson and the Modern Wisdom podcast. Okay, and only the other day he was talking to, Rory Stewart, and about just how awful Britain is and the real sense that Britain's kind of a disaster. And so I guess to unpack why that is really important because, the first step to sorting out a problem is recognizing there is one. And I think one of the really big problems we have in the UK at the moment is that successive kind of political regimes actually, and the financial regulator, the treasury, like all the people who you could sort of point the blame at, politicians, all of the above, just refuse to admit there's really a problem. But we all know very intuitively there's a problem. And so let's set out what that is. Well, things like, per capita income in the UK. So, annual income on average, GDP per capita, 30 years ago in the UK was roughly the same as what it was in all the other developed nation countries like Australia, Singapore, the United States, whatever else. In the last 30 years, we're basically static. And if you take the top 1% of the richest people out of the stats, a lot of people have been going backwards. So, we all feel quite keenly that Britain's not making economic progress at a personal level. Combine that with inflation and a cost of living crisis, it feels even worse, right? So then we've got to interrogate, why is it that like Singapore's now got a GDP per capita of $120,000 a year, whereas literally 30 years ago it was roughly the same as ours, which is mid 40,000s, depending on which stats you look at. Australia's at like 68,000, America's at 80,000-ish. Everyone else has powered on and done a much better job and become much more wealthy in the last 30 years. And Britain is just this ridiculous laggard. And so if you want to then sort of go down the rabbit hole on why that is, and what really pains me is my very firm belief that like literally without exaggeration, fewer than 1% of the population even begin to understand this. And it's not discussed by journalists. It wasn't an issue in the last election, which is kind of why I've just spent 3 years, putting a lot of this stuff in a book because I'm that annoyed about it. But so let's look firstly at the fact that in 2007, there were 3,250 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, right? Today, there are fewer than 1,800. And everyone's like, well, why does that matter? That's just those people in the city, those nasty, evil investment bankers. And that's not relevant to actually the man in the street or the women in the street. Yes, it is. It's massively, massively relevant because like smaller companies and the smaller end of the London stock market is where you build like 100, 200, 500 million, billion pound companies. That's where 60% of employment comes from. And it's where 50+% of UK turnover comes from. And obviously by extension, profitability. Smaller companies, and particularly, because like smaller companies obviously encompasses, a florist or a baker or a family owned restaurant, right? Which, are very important as well in their own right for wherever they're based, for the local community. But smaller companies on the stock market that are valued at 100 or 200 or 300 or preferably 500 million and beyond, as I was just saying, are absolutely or should be the engine room of our economy, of employment, of tax receipts, of growth, of innovation, of, biotech, for example. They're the companies that might cure cancer. And the other thing is they are where, self-evidently, large companies come from. So actually, it wasn't that long ago that Apple was a relatively small company in the grand scheme of things, compared to Microsoft over 20 years ago. They were a funny little manufacturer of like pink, pink computers for your gran or for artists. And now they're the world's most dominant kind of mobile phone manufacturer and everything else they do. And that's happened in 20 years. And so, look at NVIDIA, for example. NVIDIA, I think I'm right in saying there are 10,000 members of staff at NVIDIA who are now worth north of $20 million.
Wow.
Right. And something like 25,000.
Share options.
Yeah, I think largely crystallized shares actually, but clearly if there's a massive tech correction and Nvidia halves, there'll be a fewer. But there's 26 odd thousand employees of Nvidia, a significant majority of them millionaires, and thousands of them are worth $10 million. If Britain had one of those, and I acknowledge that Nvidia is a pretty full-on outlier and the most successful company of the last decade. But we've been going backwards, and then let's look at the evisceration of our equity culture and of the efficient functioning of the London stock market has had a huge negative impact on the population, which like no one's talking about, which is what drives me mad listening to Radio 4.
So what do you mean by the evisceration of our equity culture?
So, and it's largely been driven. It started under Blair and Brown in the 90s when they changed the tax treatment of dividends for basically how pension funds function, and then also we put really draconian rules in place around how pension funds are allowed to allocate their capital, right? And the upshot of that is that in the last 30 years, we've basically £1.5 trillion has gone out of UK shares and into bonds, or more pertinently abroad, like into American shares, into shares elsewhere in the world. And there's some great work. There's a guy called Simon French, who's the chief economist at Panmure Liberum, which is one of the big, like mid-sized London stockbroking firms. And he's a very, very smart economist, has a regular column in, I can't remember the Times or the Sunday Times, whatever. And he produced a chart, which for me, in terms of your question about what eviscerating the equity culture is kind of, if you want a one-stop shop, here's just one picture that tells 1,000 stories, or whatever the expression is. He produced a chart not that long ago, which shows basically all the leading economies in the world, the percentage of the global stock market value that their stock market is, and the percentage of their domestic pension fund industry has got invested in their own domestic stock market, right? So Britain is now about 4% of global, what you say, market cap. Like the aggregate, if you add up all the value of all the stock market listed companies in the world, there are actually 60 stock markets in the world. Britain is about 4% of that today. By the way, we were 10%, like as recently as 30 years ago. So
we were 25 at the turn of the 1900s or something.
Exactly.
Maybe.
And so it's been, but the acceleration recently is disastrous. And it's all entirely because we shot ourselves in the foot with terrible regulation. And we can come on to that in more detail. But so Britain's 4% of global assets, and here's why. Only 2.5% of British pension assets are pensions. Whether you work for a big company or a small company, you have a private pension, only 2.5% of British pension assets are in British shares. Now, just take a step back for a moment. What's the number in places like Australia, America, Singapore, whatever else? Well, in Australia is about 1.5% of the global stock market aggregate value. It's 40% of Australia's domestic equity.
Should we force a home bias though? Because the UK market's underperformed significantly.
No, but it's chicken and egg.
Do you think?
This is what everyone's constantly critical of British companies. British companies are rubbish. We shouldn't be investing, but let's invest in American companies. But it's absolutely chicken and egg. It's absolutely circular. The reason British companies struggle is because our capital depth is. We've exported. One thing we're really good at exporting is our capital, our nation's wealth. We've exported £1.5 trillion abroad, and the government has driven a massive switch out of equity. So we were more than 50% of British pension assets were in UK equities, like as recently as 30 years ago. Now it's only 4%. And we've gone massively long bonds. And in my view, I genuinely think there should be a sort of Spanish Inquisition steward's inquiry about the individuals that made those policy decisions 30 years ago, because this second order, like the ramifications of that for British wealth, for GDP per capita, for the cost of living crisis have been seriously bad, right? And so if you imagine you're a British entrepreneur and you want to build a business, and British equities, because of everything I'm saying, are rated, so their stock market multiple, because the way shares are rated is on a multiple of profitability. So British shares are currently trading at between 40 and 60% discount to American shares. Well, 60% to American shares, 40% to global shares. Partly because of Brexit, that was one of the catalysts, but it's been a slow motion car crash for 30 years, as I say. What that means, if you're a British CEO and you're trying to build a business, whatever that might be doing, is it's twice as expensive for you to raise money to do anything, to acquire another company, to open a factory, to build a refinery, to do whatever, right? So if it's twice as expensive for British companies to do things in terms of raising capital, then funnily enough, they're going to have rings run around them by all the other companies elsewhere, right? And what the other fact that illustrates this is the number of British companies that get acquired by Americans or Europeans or
Private equity buying up.
Yeah, or large companies. Yeah. It doesn't have to be PE. It can be. I'm trying to think of an example. I'm sure. Like Cadbury's was acquired by Kraft, or there are literally hundreds, and that is an absolute national scandal because it's like if we had a functioning investment industry and we haven't had all this dreadful, wrong-headed regulatory change and tax changes and just really, really ill thought out. I mean, the basic problem is going back to the eviscerating equity culture thing is. We've obviously had a lot of people in places of responsibility, in places of power, whether that's at the Treasury or the FCA or the political class, who, sorry, I think I spat at you there.
No,
as you said, politics,
politics,
it's fine.
I did that on purpose with apologies to you.
Don't worry,
but they seem to have lost sight of like 2 centuries of evidence about the efficacy of equities, of shares, of the stock market as a key investment class. And there's this really wrong-headed idea that shares are just really, really risky, starting 30 years ago. And it's, by the way, this isn't party political. It's happened under Labour and the Tories. It's just been death by 1,000 cuts for 30 years. But I think the most galling thing of all for me with all of this is this wasn't even an electoral issue. Like this is front and center. I think anybody who's spent any time working for a major investment bank or in the investment industry or like really thinks deeply about kind of the state of the British economy, financial services, how this stuff is all interconnected, the real economy, real people, real jobs, GDP per capita, our aggregate wealth as an economy, anybody who really gets this stuff and is a student of this stuff knows that the complete decimation of our pension industry and of our stock market and what that's wrought. Now, I feel this particularly acutely because I've just spent 10 years trying to raise money for biotech companies and they've been the worst affected of all. And that it's kind of most annoying because, Cambridge University has produced more Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine than pretty much any other country. And Oxford's not far behind. And, Britain is just absolutely magnificent at bioscience and all sorts of science, right? But why have we failed completely to create any trillion-dollar companies? Or, I know we talked before about Novo Nordisk. Denmark has created a $450 billion company called Novo Nordisk, which is originally one of the biggest diabetes companies in the world, and latterly the weight loss, famously Ozempic, Wegovy, right? It's an absolute national disgrace that Britain, we've got Astra and Glaxo, which are both pretty solid companies.
Pretty big.
Both of them are,
Pretty old though.
Pretty old, and Astra's just decided to spend $360 million building a factory in Ireland. By the way, I'm an Irish passport holder thanks to my dad, and I was doing some research ahead of this the other day, and I was amused to note, and very proud to note, that so our GDP per capita in the UK is $46,000 or whatever it is. Guess what Ireland's is today? Ireland, which when I was a little boy going on holiday to Ireland, it was a fairly poor country in comparison.
57.
No, I think it's 100 or
120,000.
120K, yeah.
But they've got like Google headquarters
yeah,
and things in Ireland.
And Astra have just decided to invest $360
million. So what makes Ireland so attractive for these companies?
Much better policy.
Yeah.
Much better policy. And, you can point fingers and say maybe they're a little bit, obviously Google and Apple have both just been fined by the European Union because of the transfer pricing, the profitability into their Irish subsidiary where the Irish let them off loads of tax and they're having to... So, there are question marks about that. But big picture, the overriding thing is look at the trajectory of Britain in the last 30 years and it's an absolute catastrophe, right? As a statement of fact. And compared to a lot of the rest of the developing world. And then we've got a regime that refuses to acknowledge that there's a problem. I shared a thing about financial literacy. What's it called when people sign a petition to the government about make financial literacy, financial education compulsory in secondary schools? Yeah. And I shared it on social media not that long ago, and it got quite a few signatures such that the government had to issue a formal response. And, it was the most self-serving, like, well, financial stuff is taught in key stage, whatever, at school and blah, blah. It's like, yeah, but 90% of British adults don't have a stocks and shares ISA. Like, the amount of self-serving nonsense that comes out when you point the finger at them and say, look, Britain's lost £1 trillion of value out of its stock market in the last 30 years. The reason we have a cost of living crisis is because we're not generating wealth, and we've lost like half of our stock market list of companies. Anybody who's half good as an entrepreneur in all sorts of sectors is Arm Holdings. We're going to start with, right? Yeah. Arm Holdings is the biggest company that has come out of the UK in a generation, and it's listed in New York. 13, so out of 14 British biotech companies that have floated on a stock market in the last 20 years, since 2018, not in the last 20 years, 13 of them have done that not in the UK, and 11 of them have done it in NASDAQ in the States. And it's like, I'm following the UK election this year, and there wasn't a single journalist or a single politician even discussing this stuff. And it's like, oh, cost of, nasty Tories, incompetent Labour, whatever your view is, it's like hiding in plain sight what the problem is, and no one's talking about it. And the reason for that is because nobody in Britain, or such a vanishingly small percentage of the British population, care about or are interested in finance.
We can't ignore the fact that the UK's underperformed, say the American market. So by having a forced home bias, are we not committing people to underperforming?
So the crucial thing there is just asset allocation, right? Optimal asset allocation. So you don't. We're not saying that tomorrow you wave a magic wand and suddenly put all British pension assets back into British equities, right? No, but British pension assets, it needs to be gently, and not the absolutely ridiculous state of only 4% of British pension assets being in UK equities, right? The rest of the world has 40% or 50% or 60% in pension assets. We're at 4%. Now, I'm not saying that tomorrow we mandate that all pension funds although, by the way, if we did, the London stock market would go up a lot very quickly, right? Think about it that way. Like we can't do it that way. It would be too disruptive. It would be crazy. But it's just about getting the asset allocation mix roughly right, which is a
4% allocation when the UK market is 4% not right?
No, because that, if you want us to be twice as poor as all the other developed world countries, which should have a 40% allocation to a 1.5% market, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, because you've got to invest. If you want a vibrant economy and wages and tax receipts and growth and innovation, you don't get that from investing in bonds. You get it from investing in equities, and that's what we've lost sight of. So I think we can have our cake and eat it, but because it's just the point is it's just how far the pendulum swung because of really bad regulation, and it doesn't have to swing all the way back to like 55% should go into UK equities, but trending back in that direction would almost certainly be very good for
Mansion House reforms and stuff are that's what they're acting at, aren't they?
They've started, to be fair, they have started talking about that, the Mansion House Compact, but it needs to be done quickly.
They say putting the ball in the back of the net is the most difficult thing to do in football. So what is the most difficult thing to do in business? Well, the clue's in our name, making money. It's really hard, especially in the current economic climate in this country. So I'm happy to announce an easy way for your business to make more money if you're running a small company, including as a sole trader, and that's by using our sponsor Tide. They offer an instant access saver account where new customers can get 4.33% AER variable on unlimited deposits until at least the 31st of March 2025. If you're interested in putting your hard-earned money to work inside of your business, then head to tide.co/savings. There's a link in the description for you. For full offer T's and C's and Tide's terms, visit tide.co/terms. The variable rate is correct as of the 1st of October 2024.
To play devil's advocate, I mean, it definitely makes sense about we don't have any big companies like Nvidia making millionaires with giving people share options. But the average investor the average person in the UK isn't an entrepreneur and isn't a CEO. So these problems don't really affect them. So if you're looking at your pension, like me, for example, wouldn't you just invest, okay, I'm investing not in England, now I'm investing in America, a global
100%.
index. So why does it affect me? Obviously, the country's in a bad state, but for me and my pension, I can still invest around the world.
It's the fact that we've allowed that situation to evolve because of everything I've just said, because we've destroyed our domestic equity industry. So it's exactly right. So let's look at a couple of other reasons that have massively challenged us, right, in recent years, because you've alighted on one of them, is the inexorable rise of passive, right? So we've talked about this before.
Tread carefully.
Well, no.
You tread on my dreams.
No.
I've got eggshells in front of you here.
But passive investing, look, I talk about this all the time. It's in my first book. We talked about it last time. passive investing in an S&P 500 ETF or an MSCI World ETF, it's super cheap. It's a very sensible thing to do on a personal level, right? But John Bogle, who's the grandfather of passive, who founded Vanguard, even he said that passive shouldn't be more than 15% of the stock market, and it's now north of 50% of the stock market, depending on how you, and just, I guess, for a lot of your audience probably understand this, but the problem with passive is if like $100 billion flows into an S&P 500 ETF, which is market cap weighted, that $100 billion doesn't go equally into the 500 companies. It goes massively disproportionately into the Magnificent Seven. And so that's this sort of self-fulfilling, ultimately wrong, unnatural upward spiral, right? But the reason passive, so all the regulation in the UK and the States this is all part of the problem in the last 30 years, has driven an increasing amount of money into passive. There's a thing called the Retail Distribution Review, which basically made loads of IFAs and private client stockbrokers, like almost forced them. Because if you walk through the door and say, I want to invest in the stock market, it's far easier for them from a regulatory perspective, from all the box ticking and paperwork they have to fill in, to say they're giving you good value and a good value outcome if they just just wang loads of your money into like a really inexpensive passive ETF. And they also have higher margins on that because it's cheap for them to do that, right? Compared to the much harder thing of doing active management and ferreting out, supporting innovative entrepreneurial companies. So that's sort of, you're right. As a British national right now, the most sensible thing to do is to invest globally and probably use passive, unless you're very wealthy. And, I think wealthy people who really care about Britain, actually should almost make it a sort of sense of mission to be investing in UK smaller companies and innovative UK companies in active funds. And hopefully we'll trend back towards that. I mean, it's part of the message in the book around, if biotech is as exciting as it is, you're not going to get that by owning an S&P 500 ETF. But the other one I just want to touch on as well, because we had a giggle about it when we did the last interview, is crypto.
Yeah.
And so crypto, it's really hard to get accurate numbers, but what we do know is that more British adults have made investments in crypto. I'm only kidding. But there are more people in Britain, it's widely established, have invested in crypto than have invested in the real stock market listed stuff, right? There are more holders of crypto than there are of stocks and shares ISAs in the UK, right?
Actually.
Yeah. And when you think about it this way as well, most of the people who have stocks and shares ISAs are invested in Nvidia and Apple, right? Yeah. Not in small British companies. Yeah. So if you basically take a rough estimate of how much each of those people's put in and how many millions of them are, it's like 5 to 7 million British adults, whatever it is, you're talking about tens of billions of pounds, right, of risk capital that 2 generations ago and a generation ago, i.e. when Britain was 10% of the global stock market, not 4% of the stock market, that risk capital would have gone, when I started my career at Swiss Bank, would have gone into real companies like EasyJet to help them buy a load of airlines, or Carluccio's to help them open a load of restaurants, or like real stuff in the real economy, employing real people, paying tax, doing stuff. That 15 billion-ish pounds that's gone into crypto has not done any of that for many, many years now, because anybody under the age of 45 is like, who wants to invest in stocks and shares? No, I'll have some
token.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. And again, not an electoral issue. It's not even understood by any politician. I've never heard a politician even make this point. I've got loads of friends from the city who are like, wow, yeah, that's a really good point. I've not thought about that. So 15 billion quid, let's say, in the context of AstraZeneca, which is valued at 200 billion quid, or Shell, that's valued in a similar sort of ballpark, doesn't sound like much, but it's absolutely vital in the context of the broader economy, because of the point I made earlier about 60% of employment comes from smaller companies, right? And the fact that our smaller company ecosystem is dying. And the other point is, if you put 15 billion quid of cash into companies, the value creation is a multiple of that. It's not, you don't create 15 billion of value. You create, let's say those companies all end up on a P of 10 and they invest that money really well. You create $150 billion worth of or sterling worth of value. So, we've had the inexorable rise of passive. And that's happened because regulation has forced so many market participants to basically go passive, because it's sort of better value for the consumer, which, and there's a whole, I go to war a bit on social media sometimes with some of the I call them the passive zealots. Like, anybody invests in active is a muppet. Like, you should never invest. 90% of fund managers underperform. It's like, yeah, but you've got to take a step back and see the whole ball game and understand why stock markets were invented. Like, what is the social good that stock markets provide? It's to provide capital to companies doing real things in the real economy. And by the way, there's a huge free rider problem, because you can't have a big ETF with lots of lovely big companies in it if, like, 20 years ago, those were all smaller, or many of them were smaller companies that couldn't go in an ETF, because structurally, small companies can't go into an ETF just technically, because they have to be traded automatically and there has to be lots of liquidity. So you're not going to have companies to go into ETFs in the future unless you have an active ecosystem that's thriving and supports smaller companies going from like naught to big enough to go into an ETF, right? And everybody misses that. So regulation has pushed billions into passive, massive to the exclusion of real companies doing real things. And a lack of regulation has pushed billions into crypto, because we talked about this last time. Everything I say, I have to keep, records for 5 years. I have to record everything I do. If the FCA knocks on my door, they go, show me that email you sent in April 2020, right?
You've got to have it.
I was about to say any Muppet. I won't say that, but anybody, because not all crypto people are Muppets. To be clear,
right.
No, yeah, and I'm definitely not
You're
talking
a
about
finance pro now.
Yeah, I'm a
finance pro. But the simple fact is, that's a massive competitive disadvantage. That I have to do over 100 things a year, like form filling, numbers. Well, for HMRC, Companies House, and the FCA, comfortably, right? I'm essentially like, as an entrepreneur, running a small business, it takes such a vast amount of my time. It's a huge cost. It's a huge burden. Any punter can set up on YouTube and start telling you he can make you life-changing returns in crypto with no regulation whatsoever, right? And so that's why. So they're going to go and go, I can make you 100% a month in crypto. Check out this, and say really fundamentally dishonest things. And I go, if things go really well, you might make 8% a year. Yeah. And like,
what's more attractive?
Yeah. So their competitive advantage is massive. So billions and billions of pounds has flowed into those assets and not into real companies in the real world. And all of this stuff is like this perfect storm that has all happened sort of in tandem, death by 1,000 cuts, like a slow motion car crash over 30 years. And I've been at the coalface of it. And, this sounds like maybe a bit of an arrogant thing to say or a bit ridiculous, but I genuinely, there are probably only a few hundred people in the UK, maybe a few thousand if you include CEOs of listed companies, but people working, trying to raise money for small companies in the real economy in London or elsewhere who really understand this stuff. The politicians don't. And they're just speakers I find, right? Because unless you've actually worked, here's a hair-raising vignette for you. I have to be a bit careful about saying stuff like this, but so true story. I wrote a piece 18 months ago about all of this, summarising all of these issues for the senior management team of a London-listed company, a PLC, at their request. Like the chairman and the CEO said, "Look, Andy, we know you're writing this book. You're doing all this research. They had a meeting with Ian Duncan Smith and Jeremy Hunt, and they reckoned they could get all these arguments in the Tory cabinet. So I wrote this piece, and in my own small way, I was one of the inputs to that discussion, but it was discussed by senior Tories and everything else. All that work that they did then was given to half a dozen really senior fund managers in London who are kind of household names if you follow this sort of stuff. And a 2 or 3 really senior managing directors at leading stockbroking firms. And they went in to meet with all of the key people that you'd want to meet with to articulate, Britain's got a problem, guys. So I'm not going to, because I don't want to cast too many aspersions, I don't want to get in trouble. You shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you. But if you think about the political class and the regulatory class and whatever else, they went and had a meeting with key people that are tasked with oversight of the London Stock Exchange. And the people going in to talk to these people are like the cream of the crop, like top British fund managers and British, investment bankers. And this was one of many meetings they had. And the people they met did not know that there were stock market listed companies in the UK other than the FTSE 350.
Wow.
The people tasked with regulatory oversight of our stock market, right? And I'm not going to say who that was and where they're from, but I'm just going to say that story went around like wildfire.
That's quite terrifying.
Yeah, and it's like how, they don't even recognise the problem because they don't even know there should be another like 3,000 companies outside of those 350 companies, like there used to be, raising money to buy aeroplanes or develop new software and this is the focus of my book, obviously, or cure cancer.
I always thought it'd be great to outsource all of the time-consuming admin in your personal life. from laundry to booking flights or whatever. Things that just need doing. Of course, the same thing goes for running a business. And one of the most important bits of admin that you do as a business is compliance. I'm talking about stuff like showing you're compliant with GDPR, SOC 2 and ISO 27001, so you can just land more deals. Proving compliance with these standards isn't why you're building your business, but they're necessary to do so. So why not just outsource it? This is where our partner Vanta comes in. Vanta automates 90% of the security compliance work for you, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months, saving you significant time and costs. As a special offer, Making Money listeners can get $1,000 off Vanta by going to vanta.com/makingmoney. There's also a link in the description for you. I just want to come back to the active passive bit, because if I don't, the audience will, like, they'll lynch one of us.
You.
Yeah. Do you think, you said there that obviously there's, I know a lot of capital flows through financial advisors, so that will be directed into passive. But do you also think that a large reason for the rise in passive is poor performance of active and the fees?
But again, it's chicken and egg, right? If we still had the same regulatory position, so and it's this point I made about Simon French, the economist, showing, Britain is now 50% underweight. Its pension funds are 50% underweight British equities, right? And everywhere else in the world's like 6,000% overweight, And if we hadn't have this liability-driven investment sort of egregiously draconian rules that pushed pension funds into bonds, from equities for the last 30 years, it wouldn't have been poor performance. And actually, a lot of the up until a couple of years ago, when things really started, getting terrible, like we were at or near the nadir, and all these companies, like 6 small UK biotech companies, have gone off the London Stock Exchange this year, like gone private, because they just can't. There's no point in being there. There's no liquidity. But the long run performance of smaller company funds is remarkable, and I think we spoke about this before. But so Elroy Dimpson and Paul Dimpson, I can't remember. But anyway, 2 professors from the London Business School, Dimpson and Marsh, have been doing this piece on smaller companies for years, British smaller companies. And from 1955 to 2021, smaller companies, UK smaller companies, the smallest companies in the stock market, delivered an average annual performance of somewhere between 15 and 16%. Average annual performance. Now, there's loads of volatility along the way, but if you'd been investing in smaller companies for a decade or two as a sort of relatively sophisticated, slightly wealthier middle-class person who got that, you'd be a millionaire in like 15 years, sort of just investing maxing your ISA every year. This stuff, this is all dead. And by the way, what did that mean? EasyJet wouldn't exist without that reality. All the restaurants we love that are now evaporating. Why is the British high street so challenged? But, because of this. And as I say, I feel it really, really acutely, because I've been at the coalface of arguably the hardest bit of UK smaller companies, which is loss-making, bleeding edge, biotech companies that are trying to cure cancer. And the trouble with biotech is a structurally difficult area, because basically if you open a restaurant, you can make money next week when your first customers come through the door. If you're a fashion retailer, right? If you're a biotech company trying to cure cancer, it takes 10 years and $3 billion to go from an idea in a lab to a on-market product. If you get there, you make ridiculous amounts of money, but it does mean that...
It reminded me of oil exploration when I was listening to you describe it. It was kind of like, we've got an idea, we might find it, and loads die. So who's putting money into that?
Well, or mining, right? Because who was it? Was it Tom Sawyer? Who wrote Tom Sawyer? We'll come back. I described miners as a liar standing next to a hole in the ground back in the day and so we used to joke about. So biotech investing has a similar profile to some of the oil and gas exploration and mining. The difference is it's incredibly regulated. So in some ways it's kind of better, because it's not a liar standing next to a hole in the ground. It's real science saying these patients got better or they didn't get better, and then that's massively kind of signed off on rubber stamp by the FDA in America or the MHRA in the UK. So it's super depressing. And actually, Max King, who's a brilliant financial journalist and ex-fund manager, writing in Money Week 2 weeks ago, said, we've lost Arm Holdings, CRH, BHP Billiton, British. If you're the CEO of a British company and you're trading at a 40 or 50% discount to what you could be, because those companies are now not trading. They've got, CRH is up 65% in the year, Arm's up a hell of a lot more than that from moving to New York. it's your fiduciary duty as the CEO of a business like that to do the best you can for your shareholders and stakeholders and grow the business.
So you list abroad.
So it's now at the point where a lot of these CEOs, like the CEO of Shell or Rio Tinto or HSBC, or like our very biggest companies right now, AstraZeneca, Glaxo, right? There will be noises off from American hedge funds or big European institutional investors or Singapore-based investors or whatever from their shareholders saying, why, like, what are you doing on London? Like, you'd have a 50% uplift in your share price. Astra would become a 300 billion pound company like very quickly, and then have much more capital, be able to raise more money and do all sorts of things like to cure cancer and do all the things it wants to do. And so we really have to turn this super tanker
How do we
around.
fix that then?
So I guess that's why I just spent three years writing the book. Is so in terms of the UK specifically in the role of biotech. There's a great Welsh entrepreneur called Sir Chris Evans, who's sometimes called the Welsh Wizard. He's a bit of a maverick kind of biotech investor, and he's on record as saying the UK only needs one Genentech. So Genentech was basically the first big biotech company in the late 80s in California, and it was eventually acquired by Roche, the big Swiss pharma. So it's now Roche Genentech, was part of Roche. But the point being is that Genentech delivered so much kind of economic value and wealth so quickly just from amazing science. It became a multi-$100 billion company, and that employment and blah blah. And it goes to my point about Nvidia, or Novo Nordisk. The Danish economy, the whole of the Danish economy, the Danish GDP has been completely affected by Novo Nordisk. Like the whole country is being dragged along by, and a few other companies, but it's remarkable. And so the good news is the sort of countervailing potential to all of this is exponential science and commercial delivery, right? And if we had a handful of, sometimes there are companies that are so good and create so much value that it almost doesn't matter what the economic backdrop is, within reason, notwithstanding. But, so like Novo Nordisk has gone from being capitalized at $20 billion, 12 years ago, to being capitalized at $400-ish billion. I haven't looked today, maybe it's 450, I can't remember, but it's roughly $400 billion from diabetes and weight loss. What is a company going to be worth that has a functional cure for cancer that's an oral pill with no side effects?
Yeah.
Like $3 or $4 trillion, right? In my considered, or what?
Probably more.
Yeah.
I mean, how many, it's taking out the large part of the world population cancer. 1 in 2 people are getting it, right?
And there are so many, I mean, this is why in the book, actually, and if I may, sort of, let's take a step back and talk big picture about why biotech's so exciting.
Can you very quickly explain to our listeners what biotech is? Because I know your definition
you
is
quite
like,
broad, right?
it's like agriculture, it's like all sorts of things.
Well, it is. So the slightly, literally cheesy answer that I have for that is, the original biotech is cheese and yogurt and brewing, right? Because all biotech is using
fermentation almost.
Yeah, well, biotech is just definitionally using living systems, living things to create products and nowadays services too, right? So that's the big catch-all definition. When most people think about biotech, their brain immediately goes to therapeutic, like drugs, like curing cancer or obesity or diabetes or whatever. And that's definitely a massive focus for the industry. And, like the biotech. So the first really successful kind of biotech drug, in my opinion, was human insulin back in the 80s. So before that, insulin came out of cows and pigs, like slaughtered animals. It's pretty grim, lots of resistance
and then
problems.
people put it into humans.
Yeah. That's how, when
you had a burger for breakfast, mate. So it's not that abstract.
Slightly different to having like insulin that's been extracted from a cow's pancreas injected into your blood. I mean, that's pretty.
It's a lot.
So but that diabetes was a death sentence until the 20s, right? Just an outright, type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, and then. So the next event was the extraction and isolation of insulin from animals. And that was used until like the 80s when we figured out how to do human insulin. So therapeutics are huge. And my point being, that's a big reason why Novo Nordisk was originally $200 billion, because that was its business before weight loss. But actually, what I do in the book right at the beginning is explain that what's so exciting about biotech is it's about so much more than that. It's about, what are our biggest problems? Environmental degradation, agricultural productivity, feeding the world. The biotech industry, so if you like, the last century has been about tech and physics. So, obviously that's like automotive, aviation, silicon, AI, latterly machine learning, smartphones, the internet. We can all, if you said to a 10-year-old, what are the biggest kind of technological developments of the last century, they could tell you. And then you say, well, that's basically all physics, chemistry, physics, tech, right? And that, Moore's law, the fact that the processing power per pound or dollar spent doubles every 18 to 24 months, has been the underlying driver of all that incredible wealth creation. And it's lifted billions of us out of poverty. You know, we wouldn't be able to build football stadiums or fly airplanes or have smartphones, and
We won't be doing this.
we wouldn't be doing this.
All these
you know.
cameras
Yeah,
around,
exactly
yeah.
right. So, and I think we massively take for granted just how, you know, in 1800, everyone was incredibly poor, died in their 40s, and most children died before their 5th birthday, right? We had the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, technological revolution, capital markets. Without financial markets, none of that would have happened because you wouldn't be able to fund it. So that's the last century. It's been pretty magnificent that we can fly and we can do whatever. The next,
Sounds pretty flippant.
We can
fly.
Go to Mars,
I think
whatever.
flying's good. I don't get to do it anymore because I've got 2 small children, so I'm not going on holiday for a few years. But anyway, but basically, so the last century is tech and physics, and actually just in terms of wealth creation, that's the fundamental underlying driver of why US equities have done 10% plus returns for a century. Another fact that nobody knows. I make that statement on podcast interviews, and people go, snake oil, you know, this guy's a liar. And it's like, just Google, you know, US equity performance for 100 years, please. You know, don't accuse me of being some dishonest peddler of snake oil to give you the factual return of the US equities for a century, right? But anyway, I digress. But the next century, in my considered opinion, having been looking at this I've been looking at stock markets for 25 plus years, and I've been focused on biotech for the last 10 years. The next century is going to be about biology and biotech, and there are a number of kind of...
What makes you so certain of that? Sorry to interrupt.
Well, that's fine. Well, that's what I was about to... You know, it's for inherent structural reasons. And so they are things like the way humanity creates real wealth, all the stuff we just talking about, is by solving problems and delivering wants and needs. So, you know, architecture and construction arose because we needed places to live and places to work, and food retail and agriculture arose because we need to eat. You know, it's fairly obvious, right? The aviation industry or shipping industry arose because of whatever. The reason that structurally biotech is about to like take the torch on from tech is because pretty much all of our remaining challenges as a species are about biological systems. So most obviously that's curing cancer.
Diseases in general, right?
But this is the point. It's so much more than disease because it's like...
Aging,
that's part of disease, but going to environmental degradation.
Yeah.
Like, so the biotech holds out the promise of completely revolutionizing agriculture. So if you can revolutionize agriculture, you could rewild the Amazon, right? Imagine if the Amazon was rewilded over a period of like 20 years, then you've had a massive impact on environmental degradation and global warming. And it's you know, it's fairly clear when you consider the challenges that confront us as a species and the technologies that can solve them, that they're mainly biotechnologies. And it kind of just, sorry to crack on, but so a really good example of that, for example, and again, this is just inherent and structural, the nature of the thing, right? So if, you know, everybody understands basically how silicon works, right? Zeros and ones, you know, transistors, and Moore's law, you know, in my lifetime from 1975 to today, we have we've a billion folded the power per dollar of processors, right? And, you know, NVIDIA, that's why it's such a big company, Taiwan Semiconductor, all these, you know, ASML in Holland. The semiconductor industry has delivered the chips and everything and the processing power for this to happen, right? We're now bumping up against the limits of physics, like literally just at the level of
how much silicon we can get on a chip.
Exactly. So Moore's law is going to grind to a halt. And they've already been working on this for years. Like, things will overheat. You know, you'll need much more, like blade servers will need more cooling and more power and everything else. Basically, one of the most exciting things that biotech can deliver is
biological computing.
Biological computing.
I thought that was really cool.
That's right.
I thought that was really
because
cool.
Very simply, at a very simple level, by the way, it's probably 10 years away. But people are putting billions into it already, right? Biological processing, which we're already working on, could completely step change our processing power. And here's a really ridiculously exciting, complete skunkworks cutting edge thing. We could grow things in culture, effectively a living thing, a cellular thing in culture. It's slightly difficult how you define living, but bear with me. And it would be a storage medium whereby the way that you configure it at the cellular level, or at the level of the genetic level of the thing, is a storage medium. So however it's configured, stores the data, right? In the way at the moment, hard drives are zeros and ones and zeros and billions of zeros and ones, which are a movie or a book or whatever. So scientists are already working on doing that. With the crucial difference with that technology, that biological technology, and our current standard technology of blade servers and hard drives and stuff, you wouldn't need to power it. So you can literally have all of the information that humanity has accrued in history that you can now fit in basically, I don't know what, a 1 exabyte hard drive or whatever it might be. That's not quite true. I'm digressing because we're now creating so many exabytes of new data from genomic analysis. But anyway, like all of the assembled literature of human history and music and whatever can basically be put on a fairly small hard drive, right? But imagine we can do that and all the other data that's coming down the pipe from all this R&D, and we can put them in like these little things the size of a sugar cube, which don't need any power, instead of blade servers, which are hoovering up power left, right, and centre.
Do you ever think it gets a bit Jetson-y and we predict this mad future, and then what actually happens is we're all just stuck on our phones?
100%. And, I obviously treat that in the book a fair bit because I think even in the first chapter, I say much of what follows will seem like naivety or wishful thinking.
You say it could be Mad Max, it could be...
Yeah, it's a race between Mad Max and Star Trek.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. A sort of dystopian future of an apocalypse or everybody's wealthy and friendly.
We're fighting Klingons.
Yeah, and the only existential threats come from alien species. Exactly right. But look, I think in my considered belief, having just spent 3 years researching this and 10 years working in this sector, not all of this stuff's going to arrive next year, but there is... and to be clear, it's convergence, right? It's tech and biotech converging, because all of the really exciting technologies...
Computer processing power
exactly, because...
Did we have to get to the top of Moore's law before we could do the...
maybe, just because people won't put enough capex into the change until we really need to. But, if you think about... So things, sort of genuine things that we're able to do at the moment that are super exciting. So firstly, we've only had what's called next generation sequencing for... So we first tried to read the genetic code of a human being from the late 80s until they finally announced it in 2001. I keep saying 2001. I'm slightly worried it might have been 2002 or 2000, but who cares?
Someone in the comments will get you.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know what you're talking about. The Human Genome Project. And it's estimated it cost between $3 and $5 billion and took 13 years to do that, to go, right, this is the code of the genetic code of human beings at the level of DNA. Today, it takes an hour and costs $200. And that trajectory has absolutely left Moore's law in the dust. It's like the most amazing, impressive, exponential probably in the history of human science, right? Now, why does that matter? Because now we can accurately read genetic code. We can say, well, there's a mutation in this bit of the genetic code, and that causes sickle cell anemia or epilepsy or whatever. There are 10,000 diseases that we suffer from as a human organism that are basically one genetic defect. Then there are loads more that are multiple genetic defects that are much more complicated to disaggregate. Our ability to diagnose that and analyze that is only because of a technology called next generation sequencing that's only been around for 20 years. It was being developed when we first read the genome. Now they're fairly ubiquitous machines that are expensive, but most big labs in the world could have one. So that's completely transformational, because you can read a bacteria or a virus or a fungus or a plant or a human or a mammal or whatever, a sheep for livestock stuff or whatever. So that's slightly a sheep. Moving swiftly on. But that's super exciting. But the even more exciting thing is, and this sounds a bit weird, but so go back to 1945. And the best scientists in the world in Germany were working on rocket technology to bomb London, right? And the best scientists in the world were in Japan, were doing whatever they were doing for the war effort in Japan. And the best scientists in the world in America were working on the bomb. And they were all working in complete isolation and secrecy for their respective warring nation states. This is as recently as when our grandparents were around, 2 generations ago, right? Or at least mine. Today, every scientist in the world working on this stuff, if you've just identified this genetic mutation will cause this disease and you've written a paper on it with all your evidence, you upload it to the cloud and it's available to every other scientist in the world. So now that rests on good storage, processing power, high-speed internet. Like we need ubiquitous high-speed broadband because you're sharing huge. These files are big files, right? That's only been around for what, 10 years? Like being able to share a file that has billions of bytes in it and is, many gigabytes of data just for one thing. We've got tens of thousands of academic papers, and this is all in the public domain. It's all eminently searchable. And the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle is, so we can read the genetic code of any organism. We can interrogate the extant knowledge of the whole of humanity, which is developing rapidly every day, and say, well, that actually means this. So, we can actually do something with that rather than just going, it's a load of meaningless numbers. And the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle, in 2020, the Nobel Prize was awarded for CRISPR, this gene editing technology, where we can actually then go, okay, this gene causes sickle cell anemia, which is a horrible disease. So we can read the genetic code. The academics have figured out what causes sickle cell anemia. And now we've got a technology called CRISPR. We can go in and snip it and change it and cure it. And that was the first CRISPR-based. So theoretically, you can do that for any of those 10,000 diseases. So it's sort of like, why is biology and biotech going to be the investment theme in the next century? Because this, think about all the most valuable problems, like curing all 10,000 genetically inherited diseases. That's a hugely valuable thing. Or using fungi and bacteria and everything else to deal with microplastics in our oceans and rivers and seas and lakes, or soils that have been leached full of heavy metals since the Industrial Revolution, basically, that are now, why does America have such a food problem? Because actually the evidence is increasingly clear because of the damage done to the sort of natural balance of soil fertility and microplastics getting into the food chain. And there are various other reasons to do with how egregious their like big industrial agricultural firms can be. But, lots of illness and chronic illness and all these diseases and modernity that are massively on the rise, we can address and sort out because we can bioremediate those soils using these sorts of technologies. So it's super exciting.
Two questions on that then. How does the UK economy benefit from it, and how do the UK public benefit from it? Let's start with the economy.
So, well,
why us? Not
yeah.
America?
Okay. So the first answer to that question is we have some structural advantages because we have amazing science, and there's no question that, notwithstanding everything we started this discussion with, I'll go back to again Cambridge and Oxford between them, and actually plenty of other British universities like Bath and Dundee and Edinburgh, and it's not just Oxford and Cambridge, but they've won so many Nobel Prizes. Britain has been at the vanguard of so many of these developments. I mean, basically, gene and cell therapy, a load of that, the human insulin, all of this stuff, a lot of it was originally came out of British science.
And then other countries made money out of it.
Other countries made money out of it. And, that's because our political class is so completely financially illiterate and hopeless, like demonstrably, in my view. Because basically, what have we had now, like 20 or 30 years now, where most politicians come straight out of university and become special purpose advisor or whatever, it's got SPAD or whatever. In my view, you shouldn't be allowed to be a government minister unless you've had like 20 years of experience at the coalface of industry in the relevant thing. And that's our political system. But what can we do about that?
But doesn't.
But yeah, why the UK's? You think they're positioned to benefit
because of our natural edge in science, and actually the NHS, whatever your views on the NHS. It's a massive patient population, and we're leveraging it right now. There's a thing called the 100,000 Genomes Project, which is kind of using the fact that the NHS has access to such a huge patient population. We can use that to feed into scientific development.
It's like training data.
Yeah, exactly.
Like AIs.
That sounds a bit kind of science fiction, doesn't it?
But I think it makes sense to people now. They understand that you need like large sets of data to train things on.
Particularly now, and this stuff's all so complicated. But whether or not we can parlay that into creating a few, it would be great if we created a few £10 billion companies, let alone £500 billion companies, remains to be seen. But what we have to pray happens is that there are a handful of technologies that are so good that they create a load of value anyway. And because there's a sort of there's a potential perfect storm, a virtuous circle in the right direction, away from the sort of perfect storm of negativity we've had in the last 30 years, whereby, let's say a British company develops an oral pill that cures cancer with no side effects. Like, in all seriousness. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen next year, but it will probably happen in the next decade. Or, another company somewhere else might, but there are a few British companies that are inching in that direction. One of the biggest challenges to biotech companies, small British biotech companies in particular, is they get no press coverage. So like you're struggling to raise money. There's no institutional interest. There are no investors left. Everyone's investing in crypto. Like I need $100 million to cure cancer. Please, will somebody give me $100 million? Nope, there's no money. Like that is exactly what we've been dealing with for 30 years. But if they can soldier through, and I've first-hand experience working with these companies on fumes, like so hard, so challenging, so frustrating. CEOs spending all their time trying to raise capital from wherever they can, from like a millionaire who's got cancer in Saudi Arabia or what, wherever you might be able to get the cash together. One of the two of them might deliver something really amazing, and then it's front page news, and then it's like a household name, and then it's a multi-billion-pound company,
and then the other companies get the funding because people want the next.
And and that's the point about it being a virtuous circle. Is my genuine belief / hope is that in 5 or 6 years from now, maybe 3 to 7 years from now, let's say, there'll be half a dozen to a dozen FTSE 250 sized British life sciences companies. So that's like 800 million-ish upwards, sort of between 800 million and 4 billion value size companies. I think I'm right in saying roughly around there. When if that happens, all the big investment banks will have an analyst that covers UK mid-cap life sciences. If they have products that are changing people's lives or stripping billions of cost out of the NHS, they will be front page news. Their CEOs might become, as famous as Richard Branson or whatever, right? They will finally come out of this horrendous like nadir of the last few years and actually have the oxygen of some attention on them. And that will just pay dividends in all sorts of ways.
How does someone go, I want to ride that wave?
So ironically, given everything we were saying earlier, it's so funny we'll come back to this. So one of the big points I make in the book right at the end is, so biotech investment per se is super specialist and risky, right? So the answer actually is buy a passive fund.
Yeah.
And it really,
benefit from the trend.
If you're a multimillionaire and you're really interested in finance, I think every multimillionaire in this country is their duty to support UK small cap equities. Like that's my genuine belief.
They'll tell
right?
you to fuck off.
Yeah, correct. But
my duty is to live my life.
But it's chicken and egg, right? Because if they do, they'll go back to doing 15% a year, and everything will be brilliant. They'll make amazing returns. Companies will get funded. The UK economy will be brilliant, right? Let's say you're in your 20s and you're starting off for investment. You can do 50 quid a month or whatever. And we talked about this last time we did the interview. Yeah, put that all in the S&P 500 or the MSCI World or standard practice. What I'm saying is that as people get older and wealthier and more financially sophisticated and have more money, then a great deal more of them should be doing things like putting 10% in a UK small cap active fund or 10% in a life sciences fund. And it's about getting the right balance right. Yes, of course, like a 26-year-old is just starting out investment. Don't be investing in biotech, and don't maybe not doing smaller companies unless you're a very high earner or you're particularly into equities and finance and you know what you're doing. But we've just, again, it's the point about the pendulum. Like the pendulum has swung so far away that UK equity funds have had 37 consecutive months of outflows up until a month ago. That's killing the UK economy. Like it's killing our ability to innovate and make money and generate wealth and pay tax and fund the government and fund the NHS. And I'm not saying that somebody in their 20s or their 30s who hasn't got that much money, who's just starting off an investment, should just immediately go to small caps. But there are far more people in the UK that should be doing that. And actually, I genuinely believe, based on a century's worth of performance data, that they shouldn't just do it as a sort of help the UK PLC, charitable thing. They should do it because the record of history is that they'll make supernormal returns from doing it. And look, biotech's done 14.7% in sterling terms. US Nasdaq Biotech Index for the last 15 years, 14.7% annualized, right? Like, what can, and US biotech was already more expensive. What can UK biotech do from the absolute nadir of being on its knees? So, hang on, reading back, what was the...
How did Joe Public benefit?
Yeah. So, just like tech, so tech basically is the reason why the S&P 500 has done 10.35% annualized since 1923, right? Directly, because the Magnificent Seven stocks are like 30% of the value of the index, and you've made tons of money in Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, blah, blah, blah. But indirectly, because Visa and MasterCard rest on tech, all the investment banks use tech, all the mining companies use tech, all the oil and gas companies use tech. Tech as an underpinning theme has created all this wealth, right? And if you just owned the world, So it's slightly getting my first book again there, but that's the whole thesis. If you just have exposure to like lots of equities, a big thing like tech, you'll capture it. And biotech's going to be exactly the same because, biotech is going to revolutionize healthcare. It's going to revolutionize agriculture. It's going to revolutionize food retail. I mean, in my view, right? Not tomorrow, but in our lifetimes. So I think from the vantage point of 20 or 30 years from now, the reason that big global equities will keep delivering, high single digit, low double digit returns, and hopefully, 7-8% returns, real returns after inflation, which is enough to make a normal person wealthy, as we've discussed a lot before, is going to be because of the continuation of tech and biotech, creating even more value, like in computing and all the stuff we've been talking about. So if you just own Vanguard all world, or FTSE all world, or MSCI world, or I shouldn't say Vanguard, should I? You're not allowed to.
You can say Vanguard. You say what you want.
I'm not sure I can because I'm FCA regulated. I can't recommend a specific product, but
okay.
There are lots of Vanguard products, so I didn't.
There are lots of Vanguard global products.
Yeah, exactly. But the broad point being is the indices, a FTSE all world is like X thousand shares and captures a huge percentage of global market cap. The MSCI world is developed world, and then S&P 500. If you think America's going to carry on, delivering all the big companies, then do the S&P 500. But if you have any of those sorts of investments and you invest in them regularly over a lifetime, you're going to capture that upside from biotech.
I want to finish on something because we're running out of time. So you've been on the biotech drum, like you've been beating that drum for about 10 years now, and it hasn't happened yet, and you say you think you're 2 to 3 years away. Well, are you early? Are you wrong?
Always 2 to 3 years away. Yeah. Some of it has happened. There are British companies that have gone up a fair bit. Most have been acquired, right? But yeah, look, with all these sorts of big new sort of visionary things, without sounding too pretentious, you can't time them, right? I genuinely believe that from the vantage point of 3 to 7 years from now, because everybody I speak to in the city who's involved with this stuff is just sitting there wringing their hands going, it's just insane where these companies are. It's like, there are companies that have got 2 phase 3 ready assets, which in America would be like $1 billion worth of intellectual property, which are literally capitalized at like 2 million quid. It's just like, so, and frankly, if you buy 20 of those and hold on for a few years, then you only need 2 of them to go up 100x or 50x or 30x or whatever to have a pretty interesting return across the portfolio of those. And that very, very rare kind of once in a generation opportunity is only thrown up because of all the rubbish we talked about at the beginning of how ridiculously we've destroyed like British stock market capitalism, basically. And like all of that is a matter of record.
It was so great having Andrew back on the show.
He's a bit of a legend, isn't he?
Yeah, lad.
He got me started with investing, which I guess if you're looking to get started with your own personal finances, we put together a 2-pager that can help people. So it just covers 80% of everything you need to know about your personal finances on 2 pages. You can get it by using the link in the description. You got to look at it.
2 pages, just how I like it. Short and concise.